Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about that point in time where it becomes necessary to make the decision to put your loved one into a nursing home. Specifically, I want to think about the question of when is it time to put your loved one into a nursing home. Now, this is a huge and traumatic issue. I can tell you this is going to be heavy going. I'm going to go through a lot of stuff. I was surprised in preparing for this video the number of times I actually teared up reminiscing about my dad, and so it's tough. This is difficult material, but it's also complicated material. It really is complicated, and the answer is going to be different for everybody, and you should understand this right from the beginning. First of all, we know Alzheimer's has multiple stages. Many times it's enumerated as 3. There's also, I have a video, I'll put the link in the description, put a screenshot up maybe, where I talk about the 7 stages view versus the 3 stages view, but we don't have to deal with any of those niceties here. We can simply say intuitively Alzheimer's is early, middle, and late stage. So everybody's experience is going to be a little bit different. Everybody's actual symptoms of Alzheimer's are going to be a little bit different. Their care environment, everything is going to be unique to their circumstance, and so there is no one-size-fits-all answer, that's for sure. Somebody could theoretically progress through the entirety of Alzheimer's. In other words, do a full progression from early, middle to late stage and die, as my dad did, from the Alzheimer's directly, and they could be in their home the entire time. That is possible. On the other hand, a person could perhaps have to enter into a care environment very early, maybe even with mild cognitive impairment or in an early stage of Alzheimer's disease. They may require nursing home care, and one reason for that might be that they have some other condition or conditions that reduces their ability to care for themselves apart from the Alzheimer's. So every family, every person, their experience here is going to be entirely different. The most that I can hope to do is kind of run through a series of considerations that I hope might assist you in trying to work through these issues for yourself and for your family. But because of the complexity and because of time limitations, in other words, I don't want this to be, this could be a seminar, this could be an entire class probably, which I'm not saying I'm competent to teach, but my overview here is going to be just that. It's going to be somewhat superficial. I'm going to kind of look at and survey issues, but it's going to be necessary certainly to dive more deeply into these things. I might do that in future videos, but certainly you yourself are going to want to talk to advisors like doctors, possibly lawyers, other people who might be able to help you, trusted friends and family members who are going to help you to think through and make decisions in these very vital areas. But let me start with this. When is it time for a loved one to go into a nursing home? I'm going to say that I think actually this question should really be understood to be 2 distinct questions. So the first question I think that's really embedded in here is the question of when does it become necessary to give your loved one intensive daily assistance, care, supervision? That's question number 1. And question number 2 is going to be, when is it the case that that level of assistance is no longer possible to give them in their home or in your home? In other words, when does it become necessary to say the nursing home is the only place that can effectively deliver care to my loved one? Now, those are 2 distinct questions. But to complicate things further, I think you can only really begin to adequately answer those questions if you take certain factors into consideration. It's probably any number of factors that could be mentioned here, but I'm going to mention 4. Medical, logistical, financial, and relational. And I'll explain what I mean by those, and hopefully it'll become clear as we move along. But I need to make the usual disclaimer. I am not a medical practitioner. I am not a financial advisor. I am not a lawyer. I cannot give you specific advice on any of the things that we're about to discuss. What I am talking about is an overflow, number 1, of my own experiences that I had with my dad, to a much lesser extent my grandma, but also research that I have done, some of it for the website, but much of it going back to the time period where I was the primary caretaker for my dad and I had to make the decision basically to put him into a nursing home. But let's take that first question. When does your loved one start to require intensive daily care? So notice that this question concerns care level. It's a care level question. So one obvious factor that's relevant here is going to be the medical factor. Ideally, we would like then a way of gauging what the person's medical need is. Now, the long-term care industry has certain terms and certain metrics, or at least they're working towards a certain way of measuring this, and I'm going to mention it here. So in the long-term care lingo, essentially your loved one would require care, intensive long-term care, if he or she meets one of 2 separate triggers. The first trigger is going to be physical. So a physical trigger, and this one, and I've mentioned this in numerous other places, But this trigger essentially means that a person would lack 2 out of 6 what are called activities of daily living. Okay, they have to lack 2 out of 6. The activities of daily living are things like bathing yourself, dressing yourself, feeding yourself, being able to transfer in and out of bed by yourself, being able to toilet by yourself, and being able to maintain bodily functions, or be continent essentially is what it is. That is to say, you have control over your bladder, over your bowels, and so on. Now, once again, these are physical triggers. They can be prompted by other conditions other than Alzheimer's disease. And as good as these definitions are for the long-term care industry, they do depend on doctor evaluations in ways that can mean that whether a person lacks one or other of these is going to be open to a doctor's interpretation, possibly several doctors' interpretations. So once again, this underscores the need for you to maintain a good level of dialogue with a trusted circle of advisors, including those people who have a finger on this kind of information, presumably medical practitioners and professionals of one sort or other. Now, the second trigger, the first trigger was physical, the second trigger is mental. That is to say, cognitive impairment. So in other words, you could lack 2 out of 6 activities of daily living and be long-term care certified, or you could have a severe cognitive impairment and likewise be certified, even if you can bathe yourself, feed yourself, dress yourself, and so on. Cognitive impairment in this respect is going essentially to be some kind of severe deficit of cognition that is going to affect a person's ability to care for him or herself, or that would make them potentially a danger to themselves or to other people if they didn't have constant supervision, constant assistance. So once again, when you lack the activities of daily living, you're going to need daily assistance, and a person who is cognitively impaired to such an extent that they essentially are going to need round-the-clock supervision or whatever also is going to be a trigger for long-term care. Cognitive impairments in view, once again, dementia or a deficiency of memory, which is obviously a symptom of Alzheimer's disease. Not just that, there are other kinds of cognitive impairment. There are neurological dysfunctions. There could be traumatic brain injuries. There is other kinds of dementia. So, for example, there's something called Lewy body dementia. There are any number of different possible deficits and conditions that might prompt the need for care. And in fact, from the physical standpoint, I mean, a person could lose continence in virtue of some kind of a severe cognitive impairment, and that often happens. However, a person could also lose continence for any number of other reasons, and I won't enumerate them, but there can be additional reasons for that. And similarly, a person might lose the ability to transfer in and out of bed for any number of reasons. They might lose the ability to eat because they are paralyzed, for instance. So there are any number of different conditions that might bear here. But from a strictly cognitive standpoint, we're talking about things like negatively affected awareness, decision-making, judgment, memory, perception, reasoning. Almost all aspects of what we call thinking, behavior, emotional response, all of these can be negatively impacted. Now, the implications for such a cognitive impairment are probably fairly obvious to people who are watching the video because they're dealing with some of these, right? You're talking about behaviors that are disruptive to the household, behaviors that are potentially dangerous, wandering, sundowning, certain activities that might compromise personal safety. I deal in other places with driving. So a person who has such a severe cognitive impairment that they can no longer be trusted to even remain in a safe place, or they can't be trusted to be able to care for themselves, to not electrocute themselves, to not eat spoiled food, to not turn the gas on and forget that it's on, to not wander from the house and not remember how to get back home. These are the kinds of things that people who are living with somebody with dementia face on a daily basis, and once they reach that critical mass, once that person's deficits start to manifest in behavior that is consistently pathological, then it is potentially time to start to weigh your options. Obviously, these considerations bear on the safety of the person and also, frankly, the safety of the other people in the house. I mean, if my dad, for example, had accidentally turned on the gas or turned off the pilot light or put dish detergent in the sugar bowl, there could be any other person in the household who could be negatively impacted because of those those things. And so this brings us to the second consideration that I said, the second factor. First was medical, the second is logistical. So now remember the second question. I said when you're thinking about the question, when is it time for your loved one to be in a nursing home? The first question is, when does your loved one require intensive daily care? That's the first question. But the second question was, when can that care no longer be reliably, consistently, safely delivered in the home? So in other words, when can your loved one no longer receive their necessary care in the home environment? Obviously, this question pertains in the first place to the care environment. Now you have to understand, the Alzheimer's Proof Project, so my site, my website, alzheimersproof.com, this channel, in the first place, the concept that I had was twofold. The first was how to make changes in the home environment in order to try to make that environment safer, a more effective care environment for people who are living with somebody who has dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So that was the first meaning of Alzheimer's proof. I think of it as something like baby proofing or child proofing a house. When expectant families bring a child into the house, they have to baby proof it. Well, if you're caring for someone with Alzheimer's, you have to Alzheimer's proof your house. Now the second meaning is simply changes to your own personal diet, lifestyle to try and minimize your risk. But for the present purpose, when you think about those changes you might need to make in your home environment, what you're faced with then is the prospect of making your home environment more like a care facility, more like a nursing home, possibly like a hospital in various respects. Now, obviously, you can't completely convert the house into a nursing home or into a hospital, but you're talking about adding additional locks to doors, maybe safety latches to prevent your loved one from accessing certain rooms, from eloping. I have videos where I deal with adding certain devices onto a door or onto an oven or onto a microwave or onto a refrigerator to try and prevent your loved one from accessing things that he or she shouldn't or can't safely. This might include things like adding closed-circuit TV cameras or other kinds of cameras that you can access through your smartphone. Might include monitors and sensors or GPS trackers that you fit onto your loved one to try to recover them, really, in case they elope or wander away from the house. And those are all assists to safety. Those are almost always going to pertain to some cognitive deficit. They're going to be an assist to the caretaker to care for someone who cannot be policed without them. The second set of logistical considerations has to do with physical assists. So these are things like adding handrails, grab bars, lighting, possibly adding wheelchair accessibility, ramps, widening the doorway to accommodate a wheelchair or walkers, converting a bathtub to a walk-in, and other kinds of interventions that are designed to give a person help from the physical standpoint. But to bring in now my third consideration, medical, logistical, the third one was financial. First of all of these contemplated interventions cost money. There are any number of videos that I have on this channel where I deal with paying for long-term care, how to get long-term care insurance policies involved, how to think about paying for long-term care. I've got a lot of different content just on this question, so I don't want to make this video overly long, which it's already running long, in virtue of getting into topics that I explore in more detail elsewhere. Suffice it to say that from a financial point of view, you really only have three ways to pay for long-term care. You pay out of your own income and assets, you pay until your income and assets are spent down and you're able to qualify for government assistance or Medicaid, or you never had any assets to begin with and Medicaid is the only game in town. And the third way, so private pay, Medicaid, or number three, proceeds from a long-term care insurance policy. Those are really the only ways to pay. Now, there are really two reasons why a person might want a long-term care insurance policy. The first of those is to protect their assets so that they can be used for legacy, so that they could be used for survivor. So if you have a spouse that you want to be able to use your retirement money, you don't want to have to spend it on one person's care. You're going to need some way of protecting that asset from having to be depleted in virtue of paying for your nursing home or for your home care. But the second reason a person might want a long-term care insurance policy is to be able to exercise greater control over where they receive their care. So for instance, if you have a long-term care insurance policy and it provides for home care, then you take some of the burden off of the caretaker, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, but you may be able to stay in your home for longer than you would have otherwise if your only caretaker, let's say, was your spouse. Your spouse could be aging, your spouse could have cancer, your spouse could be unable to lift you or unable to cope with the stress. Don't get me wrong, there are other strategies. There are Medicaid trusts, for example, but really that's not a separate way way to pay. All a Medicaid trust is a way of handling your personal assets to try to prevent them from being used to pay for your long-term care. You could also implicate a life insurance policy here. There's a couple of ways to do that. One is with riders. There are chronic illness riders, there are long-term care riders, or say my dad, who was in a nursing home, it was about $300,000 for the 4 years he was in the nursing home. If my dad had privately paid, he didn't, but if he had, and if the family had had a $300,000 policy life insurance on him, we didn't, but if we had, then that life insurance policy would have, in principle, restored those funds that we paid on his care to the family after he died. Now, these are complicated issues. I cannot get into them here. There are many questions, many problems, many difficulties here, but for further information, I invite you to see my other videos where I deal more in detail with those questions. But the final point that I want to make, the final of the 4 factors that I mentioned, so medical, logistical, financial, and the 4th one is relational. I can't think of a better way of putting this except to just say this is the point where you're dealing with other people in your life, your spouse, your family, your children, your friends perhaps. And there are some tips that I have to at least suggest to you. One is plan early. Now for many people watching this video, it might be too late because you're coming to this video because there's somebody right now who has these problems. You can't go back in time and plan early. But you can take the lessons, for example, the lessons I learned from my experience with my dad, the lessons that I learned I'm trying to apply to my life in hopes that I can help my children avoid having to go through the same thing with me that I went through with my dad. Now, second part of this is, in order to plan early, you're going to have frank discussions. You cannot ostrich. You can't put your head in the sand and refuse to talk about issues with respect to end-of-life care or the possibility of long-term care. Because if you do that, you're not doing a service to any of your loved ones or to yourself. Another thing that I would say is only make promises that you can keep. If you're going to promise your loved one that they will never have to go into a nursing home, only make promises that you are prepared to keep. And from the flip side of that, only ask for promises that you are prepared to lay on the person that you're asking it from. Now, make no mistake about it. Asking a person to commit possibly a decade of their life, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it might be, to care for you in a home environment in order that you don't have to go into a nursing home. It's noble, and I can't tell you not to do it. I can't tell you to do it. I'm not telling you what promises to make or not make. I'm only saying you have to realize the gravity of what you are asking. Caretaking duties take a tremendous toll on the caregiver. They can negatively impact almost every aspect of a person's life. They can negatively impact a job. Some people might be in a position of almost losing their job because they have had to devote time to caretaking. They might be in a precarious situation financially. It's possible that children, spouses, grandchildren are kicking money in to try to pay for certain aspects of a loved one's care that maybe they can't otherwise afford. It can negatively impact the health of the caretaker. It can negatively impact their life expectancy. It can cause them physical injury, lifting a person from a bed to take them into the bathroom, or to try and get them in and out of a bathtub, or to try and wipe their butt when they make a mess, or to try to bathe them when, like my dad was, he was irritable, agitated much of the time, he was belligerent. None of these are easy tasks. This can cause enormous stress, enormous anxiety. Frankly, and here's a bit of a personal thing, I was physically sick many days worrying about what my dad might do that day, what I might have to do. I was advised, I won't say by who, but by a trusted organization, to contact the police department when my dad got out of hand. And I remember the first time I actually had to do that, or I felt like I had to do it, and the police showed up and they essentially looked at me dumbfounded like, what did you call us for? What do you want us to do? My dad was simply out of control in the house, and the police wanted to know, what do you want us to do? I mean, you want us to arrest your dad? You want us to taser him? I mean, it was obviously a very awkward situation. Simply the police presence in the house calmed my dad down, because as far gone as he was in terms of his impairment, he still had an innate respect for authority, I suppose. But at the same time, I realized in virtue of that I couldn't just call the police every time my dad got agitated like that. And so it really caused me to become sick, because I didn't know what was I supposed to do? You know, handcuff my dad to the bed? And then there can be enormous guilt. One of the most haunting images that I have, frankly, is the image of my dad being driven away from the house, me knowing that he was on his way to a nursing home to be put into the nursing home essentially for the rest of his life. I mean, you don't necessarily think about it like that because it's too painful to think of it like that, but you realize he's got Alzheimer's disease. It's a progressive disease. He is already unable to be cared for in the home. You realize this is a one-way ticket. And I had nightmares about him coming back to the house because it was so riddled with difficulty and stress, and I had two children, small children in the house at the same exact time. And so I felt horrible that I couldn't do more for my dad, but at the same time I was petrified that I would be in a position again even when my dad was in the nursing home. So it just is a psychological mess. It's a mess. It is hard enough to make an objective, good decision based on facts about the care environment and facts about the home environment. It's hard enough to do that from an objective standpoint without factoring in all of these psychological aspects which they can't be eradicated, essentially. Let me just say a few words in summation. The issue is not easy. It's difficult to get a handle on. What you're going to have to do, essentially, is think about some of the pros and some of the cons. It's going to matter the answers to those questions. When do they start needing daily care? When is it not possible any longer to provide that care in the home? Is it even possible at all to provide care given their home environment or your home environment? If it isn't, then you have at least the makings of an answer. You're either going to have to make changes to your home environment or you're going to have to look for an alternative environment. Now, of course, in principle, some of the pros that go along with a nursing home are in principle that the home is going to be safe, it's going to be secure, it's going to provide them with skilled care that they desperately need. In theory. In practice, many nursing homes are substandard in a variety of ways. They are understaffed. Many of the people are overworked. They tend to over-medicate. They're underpaid. This can lead to a lack or a deficit of attention on your loved one. It can even make it the case in some people's judgment that your loved one might decline faster in a nursing home than they would decline in another environment because no one loves your loved one like you do. That doesn't mean you can't be involved, so you want to keep that in mind as well. But the other major factor here is going to be cost. What is going to be the impact in terms of finances? Do you have resources? Is Medicaid the only game in town for you? And if it is, then you have to realize Medicaid is going to limit the location where you're going to be able to find a nursing home that takes Medicaid, has an open Medicaid bed, and possibly you're going to be faced with waiting lists for certain nursing homes, and you may end up having to put your loved one in a location that's not ideal, that's not located close to you. There are so many different factors here. Again, I told you this was going to be a whirlwind. I'm sorry that it has gone as long as it has. Obviously, the very final thing that I'll say is clearly we want to try and make a decision that is in the best interest of our loved ones. We want to think about it in terms of objective interest, in terms of where are they going to receive the best care available. But at the same time, I recognize that not everybody, there's going to be different ways of weighting factors here. If you've made a promise to your loved one, if you know that he or she would be uncomfortable outside the home environment and you want to make every effort to try and accommodate their wishes, I respect that totally. But you have to realize the difficulty involved, and I'm sure many people do, but at the same time recognize that there are other people in the same position that you are, and part of the entire thrust of the Alzheimer's Proof Project is trying to assist you. It's trying to assist you in order to keep that promise or in order to make your home environment as safe as possible. Now, is it going to cost money? Yeah, unless it's good, unless you have some handyman or carpenter in your family, or unless you yourself are able to perform some of these interventions, it's going to cost money no matter where they receive their care. You may have to, at some point, reach out to other people. You may even have to bite the bullet and actually put them into a nursing home if you can no longer reasonably meet your obligation. Because you have to remember, too, that it not only does it impact your health, but obviously if they are receiving substandard care, it's not doing anybody any good. This is obviously a very, very tough issue. So I hope that something that I said was of help to you. I hope maybe it got your thinking going. I hope it provided an answer possibly that you were looking for. I am going to try and make videos possibly touching and going more deeply into some of the other things that I've discussed. But this video, I need to wrap it up. I thank you for watching. I invite you to check out some of the other content that I've done. And all I can really say is I wish you the very best in making this decision. Thank you.